Hello and welcome to the first part of our discussion of Chapter 2 from American Media History, the Press and the Revolution, meaning, of course, the American Revolution in 1776. The key theme of this chapter is the power of the press to manipulate public opinion on a grand scale. We'll see that, in fact, most people weren't convinced that they should be independent from Britain, and so the powerful leaders in the colonies used the press, meaning newspapers, tracts, other published materials, to convince people on the grand scale that it was worth fighting a battle to be free from Britain. Also, if this sounds familiar, this is the kind of thing we talk about, the influence of Fox News or CNN or MSNBC to sort of move public opinion one direction or another. Well, if that is the case, we have a long tradition of that in the United States. We'll see that it goes back to before the Revolution. So the goals of this chapter are to understand what led to the American Revolution, to explain the role of the press in inciting the revolution, and to understand the impact of the revolution on the press. So, as I've alluded to, actually the American Revolution was a reluctant revolution. There was very little demand for independence from Britain, even 10 years before. The colonists felt closer to Britain than they did to one another. That is, that colonists who lived in Pennsylvania felt closer to Britain than they did to other colonists who lived in New York, for example. In fact, Benjamin Franklin saw America as the center of the future British Empire. But two things changed his mind. The first was the 7 Years' War, and the second was the Stamp Act. So the 7 Years' War was a rivalry between Britain and France over land in Canada and near the Mississippi River. It ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, which secured the whole eastern seaboard for Britain. However, Britain was left nearly bankrupt after fighting the war. And of course, they still had two continents to govern. They had Britain, and they had the American colonies. So they expected the colonies to help pay for the war. The problem was that the colonists didn't feel particularly grateful for Britain's help. Nonetheless, Britain imposed taxes, and the worst of which came to be known as the Stamp Act of 1765. What the Stamp Act required was that everything written or printed on paper, except for books and personal letters, would be required to carry revenue stamps. In other words, proof that the paper had been purchased and a tax had been paid for it. Now, the burden for this fell, of course, on newspaper editors and publishers and lawyers, because they published newspapers, tracts, and so forth, and of course the lawyers printed legal documents. These were probably the two worst groups, though, that the mother country could have chosen to tax, because they were in the position to bring the most harm. First, by raising public awareness of injustices, and lawyers arguing about why such taxes were unfair. We sometimes think that it was the Boston Tea Party and resentment about taxes on tea that was the primary instigator of the revolution. But actually, this whole notion of taxation without representation goes back to the Stamp Act of 1765. Now, the British point of view was actually understandable. There was ample precedent. There had been a stamp tax in England for 50 years. Britain needed the money after the 7 Years' War, and they felt that the colonists were being asked to do no more than the subjects at home. So they really didn't understand what all the to-do was about. Well, Benjamin Franklin was very aware of the concern that was growing in the colonies, so he went to England and spoke before Parliament and made an impassioned appeal for the repeal of the Stamp Act. And so in 1766, it was. Benjamin Franklin came home. Everybody was thrilled to hear about the repeal of the Stamp Act, and pretty much ignored the fact that immediately after repealing the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act of 1766, which was actually much broader than the Stamp Act, that they could impose any law they wanted to on the colonies, including tax laws. When Benjamin Franklin realized what was happening, he said that the breach between the two countries has grown wider and in danger of becoming irreparable. As things began to move toward revolution, the colonists divided into three political parties. The first were the Tories, and the Tories were loyal to Britain. They refused to bear arms against the British in the War of Independence. They saw themselves as British subjects and wanted to remain that way. The Whigs were a rising capitalist faction who believed more in property rights than human rights. In other words, they owned a lot of land and they wanted whatever political system would allow them to keep that land and, in fact, grow their wealth. They were on the fence as the revolution was developing in the years before, but after the war started, they supported the Patriots. Now, the Patriots were the leading group of people who wanted social change. They were the ones who instigated the revolution and, as we'll see, did pretty much anything they thought was necessary to bring about a willingness to declare independence from England. They easily dominated the war of ideas before the war, even if much of what they said was not true. In the next segment, we will spend some time talking about the political parties and the voices to revolution